Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Go outside, give me my laptop, yelled Michael on the phone. Wait, I can't leave work right now. Don't you feel sorry for me and my daughter? I mean, you're not helping us at all. And you're drowning us. Are you trying to get me fired? You said you'd be here at the end of the day. It's morning. What am I doing at a cat's day in the middle of the workday? You don't have to get on my nerves. You've already left us with the little one. She spit. She was sick of her ex-boyfriend. How could she even get involved with him? There was no way she would have given him that laptop if not for Jack, her little girl's favorite cat. He purposely kept it for himself when he changed the lock and just wouldn't let them in the house. There was no way her only daughter's nasty ex-father would give Jack away and spite her. Even though he was over 40, he constantly acted like a cranky, spoiled child. Luckily, he needed this laptop. She actually bought it with her own money. But now she has a computer at work, so she can get by. But about the Jack, her daughter cries every day. The fluffy Siberian cat has captured Miranda's heart forever. And her own. They took him in a year ago, but he's already won women's hearts. But Bruno took him out of spite, just to spite them, and gladly agreed to trade it for something more useful and expensive. But how do you explain the cat showing up at work in the morning? Betty was counting on Michael to bring the Jack in the evening. Then there wouldn't have been a problem. She'd already arranged with the owner of the firm that she might leave an hour early. Strangely enough, Betty had no secrets from the elderly owner of the company, Kevin. She told him her story from the beginning, and the man summarized it. All in all, the usual story. The girl Betty grew up with an alcoholic father who gave her no attention. So it seemed to the girl that it was necessary to find both a husband and a father in one person. And of course, it seemed to you that any ugly and poor man older than you would love you all your life and become a reliable support. Am I right? Well, yes. I didn't even like Michael very much. He just won me over by being kind and gentle and listening and comforting at first. Confirmed Betty. Right. And then it turns out he was inspired by an early connection and ran off on his own 2 feet to conquer new heights. Didn't want to deal with the baby, Kevin asked. It was Michael's hope that I would lower the bar and tolerate his affairs, and he would go out as much as he wanted. And then His Majesty would be gracious enough to play the occasional father figure to Miranda. But he doesn't want a daughter at all. Michael had given up his rights to her just to avoid paying child support, Betty said, dimming her eyes. She realized she looked like a fool herself. She'd gotten involved with an ugly and poor man, older than herself, whom she didn't even love, gotten pregnant by him for some reason, and put up with him for some reason. She must be a complete idiot, and they're lucky Michael dumped her. Okay, I'll hire you. And here's an advance of 40,000 R to cover your housing problem. That's 2 weeks in advance. If you do a good job, you'll get interest. Do you have a place to live now? You're from out of town, aren't you? Kevin asked. He was always attentive to people. After all, when he was young, he and his first wife had been renting apartments, so he remembered very well what problems can happen at Betty's age. Yeah, out-of-towners, but 40,000 is too much. I'm staying with a friend for now, and then I'll get a room. No down payment. What if I run away with the money? She started babbling nonsense and cursed herself for refusing to help. She is, after all, an incorrigible fool and her own sworn enemy. Why don't you put on a sweet face and just take the money? After all, her friend's mother had made it clear last night that it was time to do the honors. The other day, the room they were occupying with the little one was going to be renovated. She was afraid Kevin would really listen to her and take the money back. And why would she say that? I'm not the best judge of character. You're running out of money. If I did, I'd be able to forgive my neighbor's debts, because I'm not without sin. Anyway, it's a small sum. Take it, and don't worry about it. At the same time, I will check you for honesty, asked the gray-haired man, and smiled good-naturedly. He liked this lanky and knave girl with the trappings of a noble heroine of the novel. She's not well-tempered, but she thinks well. And she's a beauty if she's dressed up. And she doesn't get lost in such a difficult situation. And the fact that she trusts people too much will pass with the years. He's seen it a lot in people from families where one of the parents drank. Other people from normal families often reproach such people, saying that they could not have foreseen this or that. But Kevin himself had a drinking mother, so if it wasn't for the army experience, he would have lived like a fool too. Good thing the guys didn't teach him. I don't know how it happens, but in families with drinking parents, children do not grow up inside themselves. They just become big adult children and continue to strengthen in life. So Kevin was not surprised by this story in any way at all. Take him for example. Even though he's gained experience, he's still a fool of a fool in places. Take his wife. She'd been having affairs behind his back for so many years, and he'd only thought to divorce her a couple of years ago. Here he was to help this young woman. This conversation had happened a few months ago, and they really wanted to run to Kevin and tell him all about the stupid situation with the cat, as if the owner of the firm were her grandfather. After all, the boss really was in his early 60s, and although he was sturdy and trim, but the wrinkles on his face gave away his age. Kevin was never young, though. While the woman was deciding what to do, Michael started ringing again. There was no time to go to the chief. After all, once offended you fight, turn around and leave. Betty went outside. "Come on, Jack," she said to her ex without even smiling. The man looked as proud and smug clown as ever lately. On his short legs were colored pants that Michael thought made him look like a young, handsome man. The wind ruffled his heavily permed neck of hair, and a sweater in a cup emphasized the only pride stretched-out figure without a belly. After all, slenderness Michael had always prioritized. After all, he left his first wife only because she performed after childbirth. But Betty didn't. But he left her too. It's just a pity she didn't realize before that there's nothing good in this man. He just betrays everyone and makes up reasons for it. That you're not happy to see me. The ex stretched out. He wanted to make fun of her somehow. Any word she said to him, it would have been hurtful in some way, which was why Betty was, however verbose. Michael had a habit of picking on everything and turning everything into torture. Everything was wrong for him. "Here's the laptop," Betty said. She saw that the Jack was indeed sitting in a plastic cage and breathed a sigh of relief. At least he hadn't cheated here. "Michael, what are you doing here? You don't have a college degree." The ex got to me. She didn't really graduate because she got involved with Michael and had a baby. He didn't provide for her and Miranda, so she had to work her ass off. "A cleaning lady," muttered Betty. She didn't want her ex to find out about her high salary. He'd find some other reason to get on her nerves. "I told you not to change, and you're not going to be a wise woman. You'll stay that way to the end," Michael said. And he was so happy that Betty's life hadn't gotten better that he handed her the Jack. "That's the way to do it." He said she'd be waiting for her in the garbage. Now she's gonna bite her elbows and remember her missed chance to be a real man. It'll be another 10 years. No one will even look at that fool. But Michael will always have a line of the nicest ladies waiting for him. Betty handed Michael the notebook without saying goodbye and went to her building. She entered the lobby, but went no further. What to do? Dilemma. If she went up to the office, she would obviously be misunderstood. What's she doing with a big Siberian cat? And if she calls a cab and takes the cat home, she'll be lost. After all, she thought the cat would be brought in tonight, and she didn't warn anyone. Fear, cramps ran through her body, not nausea, and she shook her head, her shoulders, preparing to receive another blow from fate in the form of some kind of trouble. She didn't want to lose this job. What's a furry miracle? Suddenly, Ethan's voice sounded. It was the boss's son. The man had always been arrogant, but it turned out Ethan loved cats. Who knew? "This is Jack. I got him back unexpectedly, and I need to take him home right away." Is there any way you could help me out? I'd just be an hour. And I could do it. Flipped through Betty. There was talk that the chief's son wasn't a very nice man, but there was no other way out. Ethan had already seen the jack. I mean, to cover for you with the cool one. Ethan had been drunk since this morning, and he also really liked cats. Well, at least he loved cats more than people. So the idea of helping the new cat seemed doubly good for him. At least someone in the office would be on his side instead of his dad's. I'd be very obliged to you, Betty said and blushed. She was scared again. Ethan was trying to scratch Jack through the bars of the cage, and he was getting ready to hiss. The cat didn't take well to strangers, especially if they were under the influence of alcohol. She put her hand on Ethan's arm and nibbled on it along with him. Really hoped Jack would understand the secret message. Please don't scratch his uncle. He's giving us money for shelter and food. Jack was understanding, stopped hissing, and Ethan was surprised at Betty. Do you have a crush on me too? The man who was 2 heads shorter than her asked in surprise. The word two in the question implied that she wasn't the only one. After all, Ethan considered himself a conqueror of women's hearts. Would you? I wouldn't dare. Office romances aren't my style, Betty muttered. And where would I go for you? Come on, it happens to singles. Don't worry, I'm flattered. You're basically okay. I'll cover for you, but I'll be there in an hour. Adopting a woozy pose, Ethan graciously released her with a regal gesture and added, yes, the driver will take you now. He nodded to the driver. The driver, of course, wasn't thrilled about the contact between the cage with the cat and the expensive car. But you can't argue with the owner. After all, Jack is no worse than the drunken girls of the owner, after which you have to wash the vomit. Come on, I'll only take you to the cage. We'll cover you with impenetrable check. Conciliatory, said the driver. Of course, you do not worry. The cage is reliable. There the bottom is not straight. But with a number, of course, better, muttered Betty. Neither Ethan nor Betty knew that the proprietor of the firm, Kevin, was watching the meeting, and he thought something was going on between them. This event unwittingly changed Betty and Ethan's lives forever. Betty, how many times do I have to tell you? You should have checked with me before you placed the order, Ethan told the young woman the next day. He didn't remember the story about the cat, and only remembered that Betty had to support him in every way possible. But Ethan, I've already cleared it with your father, said the brunette with the sleek hair and large features. She was uncomfortable. What happened? Kevin, Ethan's father, had asked her not to tell his son about the deal. And while she was grateful to the owner's son for helping the cat, she couldn't break her word to Kevin. Even though my father is the owner of the company, it doesn't mean that matters can be resolved over my head. Don't forget that my precious daddy is an old man and the firm rests on me, explained the little crooked-eyed astronomer, and a man with curly hair, a high forehead, and a slack chin. Okay, Ethan. I apologize. You know I haven't been with the firm very long, and I'm trying very hard. I need this job, so you'll have to forgive my oversight. And thank you for everything. Ethan placed a palm on her hand and smiled patronizingly. He remembered something of the cat story after all. The man continued to think Betty had a crush on him. Betty was holding out as best she could. The company she'd taken a job with paid well. They had to arrange helicopter transportation around the city and between cities, for very busy people or for those who simply decided to spend a romantic day for their other half in this way. The woman worked from an established base, so it wasn't too difficult to find bookings. Betty, of course, realized that everything was not on Ethan the manager, but on his father. Kevin had hired her right after the interview and had given her an advance. After a couple days, he saw how hard she was working. The owner of the firm also knew that she was alone with her 4-year-old daughter. Kevin warned her that his son didn't know much about the firm, but that Ethan was in charge. But could Betty have thought that the words "not very knowledgeable" would mean that he didn't know a thing and would even ruin relations with his clients? And yet she had to find a way to stay between two fires. After all, this work even allowed to arrange a daughter in a good kindergarten. nanny she has not yet pulled. All in all, it wasn't so bad. Ethan, though he was impenetrable, stupid, but most of the time he was quite tolerable and even Dutch. Betty wanted to believe he was kind. Compared to her, Ethan seemed almost like an angel, and his tendency to pick fights with his father and his toughest clients, she attributed it to envy, because every man can have his faults. Ethan's jealous, but he gets along quite well with those who aren't superior. So what more could you ask for? The job is the best in her position. It's great that she saw an ad on a banner for managers. And how lucky is she that she showed up at the wrong time at 7 o'clock and got an interview with the owner. She's lucky though. Whatever you say, you have to hold on to your luck. Why does my father always tell me what to do? Ethan thought. Once again, he was getting the runaround from his dad for botching a meeting with another key client. Why are you wearing white suits, expensive watches? What are you, a gangster from a Hollywood movie or an expensive gigolo? I've told you 100 times. It's not normal for normal people to flaunt their money these days. Look at me. Ethan looked at Dad with distaste. He really did always dress in modest jeans or a sweater. On rare occasions, he was seen at presentations in a gray suit and tie. The watch my father wore was the same award watch he got for good service. But Dad's an old man. Why doesn't he dress up? Who needs his outfits? Dad, you said yourself in front of your mother that it all looks good on me. Ethan argued with his father. I did, sighed Kevin. Well, you know your mother doesn't understand anything but praise. I just said that to get rid of her. Kevin hadn't had a very good second marriage though, and now that he's divorced his ex, he's trying to keep things at least amicable with her. After all, they still have a son in common with Nina. Kevin had no children from his first marriage, so he decided to make up for lost time. Married in his 30s to his own secretary girl pictures. While she worked for him, she behaved like a pussycat. But right after the wedding, Nina discovered her nasty temper, and it also turned out that her stupid remarks were her opinion. It wasn't coquetry like Kevin thought. The interesting thing is, Ethan was not the beauty of his mother. He was small and unassuming, but he took all the sass and stupidity from her. But he got nothing from his father. Kevin even questioned whether it was his son at first, so he secretly took a DNA test. But Ethan was indeed his child. So there was nowhere to go but back to accept his fate. Yes, he should have lived the rest of his life believing his first wife didn't give him children, and he shouldn't have tried. And now he has such a son. It's a misery. Kevin considered his son as a punishment for leaving his first wife, who had gone through a difficult formation with him in his youth. And then he had simply thrown her out when she was in her 30s, and Faith had to accept that he had to start life over again. And even though the first wife was still quite young, but remarried only 10 years later, had a hard time with the story that Kevin was not her husband for life, she loved him for real. Yeah, well, he probably deserves a wife like Nina and a son like Ethan. But still, who's going to take over the business? There's a chance Ethan will have children, and they'll be smarter. But Kevin's in his 60s, and you can't take that risk. If something happens to him, his son will be in debt in no time. And this is worse than poverty, when you are in deep disadvantage and you have neither brains nor character. Get out of it. Well, my son might cross to bear while I can. And then fate will find a way out, Kevin thought. And I said out loud, Ethan, let's not fight. You know, we don't have to look too different. You don't have to wear a watch for 500,000 rubles, Kevin said softly. Not for 500,000, but for 1.5. Ethan proudly extended his arm forward. The son did not understand anything. Not from the direct rebuke, not from the innuendo. He was genuinely unperceptive. Ethan, don't you want to go on vacation? You work so hard. This new Betty seems to be doing well. I think we could try her as your assistant for a couple weeks. What do you think? Kevin changed tactics. This time the offer was too tempting to pass up. Ethan loved to party, even though he wasn't handsome or smart or young. He was in his 30s, but his daddy's money was opening doors to women's hearts. It's a wiretap. Betty, yeah, she's not bad, but she's the main horse. That's the kind of guy who can only work so hard, said Ethan. She's not bad looking, but she's not feminine, is she? She's got a little bit of spunk to her. Ethan wasn't afraid of competition from a poorly dressed and perpetually intimidated young woman, a single mother clinging to her place like manna from heaven. There would be no trouble from such a one. So Kevin's calculation was correct. He knew his son like the back of his hand. So he gave her all the instructions you know how to do and give her a good night's rest. Kevin sighed. Although Ethan's vacation promised to be expensive, it was still a lot cheaper than his son's quote-unquote leadership decisions. In addition, Kevin noticed that Betty, beautiful, intelligent, though not confident, treated his son with warmth and sincerity. The owner of the company was an excellent judge of character. The woman was the kind of grateful person from whom you can expect many times more good in return for good. She did not gossip and did not participate in squabbles. Besides, his son didn't see her as a danger and wouldn't destroy her like everyone else Kevin had tried to put in the deputy manager position before. Although Ethan is dumb as a cork, he knows how to intrigue. It's wonderful. He's gone to the mother lode. So it took a lot of hard work before he found a candidate his son wouldn't stitch up. Ethan's been on vacation for 2 months. As the father had hoped, Kevin talked to Betty a lot and came to the conclusion that it was necessary to help her develop a liking for his son. Betty is an idealist. If she tolerated for 5 years some poor and terrible scoundrel womanizer, older than her by 20 years, his son will seem to her just a knight in shining armor. After all, he saw this Michael when he brought the cat. Tears in his eyes. How do women put up with that kind of guy? To put up with such a freak, you should at least get milk for harm. And they should give you a summer house in addition. And the woman is smart, works for 5 top managers. And she hasn't really gotten used to it yet. Yeah, maybe she's some kind of genius. She's got away with clients. And she's not jealous. I wish I could get my son to Betty. I'd offer her a big bonus for his quote-unquote adoption. Maybe I could offer her a deal like that and give her the apartment. Let her live with Ethan for at least 5 years and give him at least 1 normal grandchild. Fix Ethan's brain if she can, and he would provide for her for life and give her an apartment. Such thoughts arose in Kevin's mind more and more often, but after getting to know the woman better, he realized that despite the extremely difficult situation, the woman would not go for such a deal. She is simply not capable of deceit and hypocrisy. It was not good of him to impose such a burden on this woman as his son Ethan. But you've got to think of yourself too. Kevin was not old, and although he kept up a cheerful attitude, he realized that he would not last long. My heart was seriously sorry. He'd managed to hide it for now, but not anytime soon. He'd lived too hard a life. As for Betty, she'll still find some other troubled husband like her ex, and crying in a Mercedes is better than crying in a bus. That's what Kevin was thinking. So he called his old buddy Mason's son and asked him to meet him. Mason, well, here's the thing. You know how Ethan's been bugging me. Anyway, there's a nice girl working at my firm right now, single mom. I'm trying to get her to marry Ethan. I want smart grandchildren. And she can keep a better eye on the firm. Ethan will help. Kevin asked me straight out. I don't know, Kevin. Why spoil things? If she's as good as you say she is, especially if she's already failed once, since she's raising a child, asked Mason. He had a lot of respect for Kevin, who was his father's best friend, but he didn't want to do anything mean. On the other hand, Kevin had always given him business advice and loans, so he didn't want to say no to his mentor. It's not a mean thing to do. She's already trying to be friends with him. She sees my son as a human being. All she needs is a little help. You send them on several test trips for a long period of time under the pretext that we need to test new helicopters, and make sure they have to socialize a lot in between. If it doesn't work out, nobody's gonna force Betty to marry Ethan and me. And if it works out, I won't hurt her. You know me, Kevin summed up. Oh well, if it does, of course it will. I've got my secretary Camille on it. She'll make sure everything's perfect. But you know her, Kevin. She was a young secretary in your father's day. And you appreciate the old staff. Kevin patted Mason on the shoulder approvingly. Well, Camille does half my work for me. She knows how to answer to whom and generally understands the party policy. I gave her a top salary too, Mason said proudly, and added that she doesn't gossip. So everything stays between us. Isn't she a treasure? Asked Mason of Treasure. I should have married her instead of her, Kevin joked, though he hardly thought about it seriously. After all, Camille was like the ruler of Carlson's cartoon at home, but she really knew her job inside and out. Kevin left the office of his now deceased friend's son elated. Maybe if this Betty is so kind and compassionate and sees the good in everyone, she will be able to see what his father could not find in him. The only good that his father saw in ethics was his stupidity and laziness. Stupidity made it easy to fool his son. He believed that he did all the work himself, not the talented staff and his father. And thanks to Sam, he didn't show up for work too often at all. What saved his father Kevin from dealing with the disastrous consequences of his son showing up for work? At first, Kevin believed that his son would come to his senses and gain experience, but now the illusions melted away. The main hope was that Betty would become even more sympathetic to Ethan, or at least pitying, and that he wouldn't reject her. They seemed, at first glance, to be the most unlikely couple in the world. But my father's intuition told him that the two of them could make something work. They were made for each other like fences that were ready to settle around him. And behind the fence was Betty, and in the young Ethan. After all, Kevin had seen with his own eyes that it was Betty who had put her palm on his son's hand as he stroked the cat, and then he had given her his driver as a memento of his father. He had never once seen his son care about anyone but himself even a little bit. So the two of them could definitely work something out. She'd been with the company for over a year now. She'd gotten the hang of it. And she was especially helped by Mason, who Kevin had apparently assigned to her on purpose. If this Mason hadn't been married, Betty would have done anything. If only she'd gotten a man like that. Smart, silent, no advice, but always knows when to offer a helping hand. And they say men have no sensitivity. But Mason wasn't going to work out for her. Besides, she was now involved with this Ethan guy. Right at the beginning of their relationship, they'd gone to test drive new helicopters together to celebrate a big deal. She didn't want any of that. She had a daughter waiting for her at home. But somehow, it just kind of spiraled out of control. Ethan literally hypnotized her. He seemed so gentle and human. Yes, when she came to work, she thought he was superficial and shallow, but it turned out he wasn't. It's true, he's not pretty, but you can't drink water with your face. Besides, Betty had her own secret that she had to find a reliable man who was interested in her as soon as possible. Back when she was pregnant with a baby, she had been diagnosed with cancer. Doctors even suggested that she get rid of the baby. They said that giving birth to a baby could trigger an irreversible reaction. But then Betty believed that her common-law husband, Michael, would take care of the child. After all, he said so, honey, for my sake, just a baby, and I will do everything for you. She believed it then. After all, he was much older and seemed caring. And then it turned out that his apartment was mortgaged, and he was in debt like a silk, and a womanizer. Betty used to think that only good lovers could get away with it. That's why when she started dating her ex, she was even glad he was so boring and bland. Sure, she hadn't had many men before Michael, but still, she'd had a couple of affairs during her college years, so she had an idea of what intimate pleasures were like. And Michael, let's say, could not please a woman at all, although he considered himself a great Casanova, but it didn't matter to me. She wanted to settle down with Michael and live the rest of her life. But it didn't work out. It turned out that the child needed the former only to sit on her back and drive the rest of his life. That's what Michael told her when they broke up. When I saw you, Stupid, I knew it. Here you're the main horse, who like a doggy is attached to anyone who will say affectionate words and will serve him. I can rope you, but you're boring, and I'm leaving you. Michael, why are you lying? You're leaving me because I could fall seriously ill at any moment, and you'd be left with a daughter in your arms. Besides, I'm not giving you the money I've earned, and I'm not going to share a bed with an old man. Betty answered him. And it was all true. And now Ethan's father has hinted to her that he would be very happy if she and his son were to marry. And Ethan isn't so bad. And even though Betty doesn't love him, you have to try to at least hurt his father a little bit with a self-serving woman. So I guess she'll say yes to his sudden offer to be his wife. I mean, he promised to adopt Miranda. Enough of her daughter. Her mother and I are in dark apartments. Besides, who knows how long she'll live? It's decided. Ethan, right, Ethan? Sure, he'll probably cheat, but they get along well. And in time, they might even fall in love for real. Because sometimes people change. That's what Betty thought before she said yes to Ethan. She thought and thought and thought. Yes, she'll marry him. A mother has to take care of her daughter. Besides, if the second pancake doesn't come out wrong, she'll do whatever it takes to make this marriage work. As for Ethan, he had a different way of thinking. Okay, if his father says he'll let him run the firm when he marries Betty, with her in charge, then so be it. The main thing was to let the old stump leave him alone with his lectures that before Betty, she was quite all right as a base wife. That's what Ethan was thinking. In Ethan's mind, he must have a basic model of a wife who solves his most basic needs. In this case, working for him and getting along with his father. But for easy relationships, he has a sweetheart. She makes even his uncle in his 30s feel like a crowning glory. If you want to know what the smart guys are talking about these days, he calls Christina. She's known in his circles as an intellectual, if he needs to get off his ass. Then there's Nancy, the sporty biker. She listens to him with her mouth open. Nancy's always interesting and easy to get along with, and she's always at his beck and call. Then there are the red-headed twins in his notebook, who are good just because they're cool. And when one wants to eat exotics, she's not a bad little doe. True, she charges him a lot of money, but it's worth it. Anyway, you gotta spend money on every lady. And it turns out she was the cheapest, and even made a profit. All it takes is to put her on the second floor of his cottage with a child. If he doesn't want to see her, he won't meet her at all. She has no complaints. She doesn't ask for gifts. She dresses modestly. She wouldn't even think of having lovers. So if her father thinks she's a good match for Ethan, so be it. Besides, she's not entitled to anything under her personal contract. So if anything goes wrong, he'll just kick her out with a kick in the ass. Ethan's never been serious about anyone but himself. And so Ethan and Betty got married. Kevin gave Betty a watch for the wedding, but she refused to accept it. It was too expensive. A Ulysses Narden, not a fucking Ulysses. We could use the money to buy a cheap apartment in the small town where she was born. Uncle Kevin, can I have the watch then? I like the anchor on it. It's so pretty. I'll wear it around my neck with a jack. Can I, smiling, asked Miranda. The little girl was charming in her directness. You can, of course, but don't lose them. I don't think Jack will like it, Kevin said and patted Miranda's blonde head. The girl was bright, and they even played chess sometimes. And the 5-year-old sometimes almost won thanks to her non-standard thinking. I wish I had grandchildren like that, Kevin thought. He didn't know about Betty's secret and the fact that this marriage was rather a forced measure for her and that she was hardly going to give birth to anyone else. She was afraid her daughter would be orphaned. Where else would she risk a second pregnancy? Immediately after the wedding, Kevin went to a warm place, as he had long dreamed. Via video link, Betty reported to him on how things were going at the firm. If she couldn't handle any questions, she could always turn to the son of a former coworker, Kevin, Mason. Surprisingly, such a busy man always had time for her. Betty explained it by the fact that he simply respected Kevin very much and tried not to abuse Mason's good attitude. But the man seemed to be deliberately trying to make their meetings last longer. Maybe he likes her, but he's married and Betty is married. She doesn't need an affair on the side. Ethan's husband didn't show up home very often, but Betty understood the rules of the game and never pawned him off. Never told Kevin Nikolaevich that family life was not working out normally. After all, Betty had gotten security. Besides, now she received, besides the manager's salary, she also received interest from the deal. So she was able to save some money. She didn't trust banks, so she kept her savings at home in a shoebox. The old-fashioned way. Her money was nothing to Ethan. And the security in the house is good. Despite the fact that Ethan was having affairs on the side, but the man did not advertise it. Betty took it as some kind of sensitivity and delicacy towards her. She tried her best to love him. And the woman began to succeed. Like some people, and spirit pets, and attribute deep thoughts to them. So Betty and the spirit created her husband and saw in him now sincerely something deep. A woman can love out of gratitude and simply because she herself is a good person. Everyone knows that people see in others a reflection of themselves. So if a man is good, he can love anyone. But a scoundrel always suspects everyone and sees only flaws, even in the best people. After all, Betty had a father like that when she was a child, who was clay. So Betty had to choose the same kind of people. And she couldn't help it. She thought it was the norm. Besides, she has a working daughter, a husband she loves, and who doesn't abuse her. At first, Betty was afraid Ethan would demand a child from her, but he wouldn't talk about it and didn't want to be a father yet. Kevin, on the other hand, has periodically asked how it's going on the pregnancy front. He even offered to help her find a good doctor. But Betty was in no hurry to give birth. It was a good thing her disease wasn't progressing, but a pregnancy could change everything. And yet fate made a change. One day, she saw 2 stripes on the test. Ethan, we're having a baby. She told her husband, afraid of his reaction. They had been living together for 5 years, and her husband had become increasingly estranged from her. There was nothing she could do about it. And yet they sometimes slept in the same bed. How could she not be guarded? But now she's expecting a child. The woman would never dare to get rid of the baby. After all, she loved children and also believed in God and thought that the Lord would not send a test that she could not withstand. After all, no matter how her life turned out, she was not hungry yet, and she always had a roof over her head. Even after all the vicissitudes, Betty was the kind of woman who believed you should be thankful for everything, both for what you have and for what you don't have. God knows best from above. Father will be happy. I'll call him now, Ethan said. He kissed his wife dryly on the cheek and looked at her more closely. Yes, in the 5 years since they'd been married, his wife had changed for the better. Stylishly dressed, refined, beautifully groomed lady. And yet when she talked to him, she was back to being some kind of insecure girl, looking at him like a dog, waiting for a reaction from or petting him. Ethan liked that. Sometimes he'd deliberately knock her down, as he called it, like saying she hadn't gotten old, or was he bored with her? He would take on an indifferent look, or even make up that his father was displeased with her. His wife took his word for everything. She was at her wit's end. Very naive in personal relationships. She's got a lot of rope. She seems to be very smart at work, checking things out. But at home, she's just a pet chicken. Angina. Miranda's daughter was quiet and capable, so she kept out of Ethan's sight. She studied well. Like her mother, she was no trouble at all. There was only one thing that bothered Ethan about the whole situation. If Betty had a baby with him, she could claim something. And Ethan, to tell the truth, hoped that the father would not last long and that he would be gone. It would be possible to replace Betty with some more advanced model. For example, with intellectual Christina. Lately, Christina's father has moved up the ladder of power. So to the size 5 breasts and perfect buttocks, red brunette much more useful attached. As for the firm, Christina could probably run it just as well as Betty. After all, everything was already fine-tuned and running like clockwork. Ethan was not aware of the fact that to have a vestige of intelligence and to be a manager and managerial talent were different things. Ethan believed that any woman who seemed smart to him would fit the role of his base wife. And there were a lot of people smarter than Ethan, because if you don't have a brain, it's not easy to appreciate someone else's intelligence. "Dad, we're having a baby." The son decided to tell his father the good news himself, and as best as he could, he put warmth and joy in his voice. "Son, that's so great. Did you adopt Miranda as promised?" Dad asked. Ethan had wanted to adopt a daughter for a long time, but had never gotten around to it. "Dad, but it's not urgent. After all, we are serious." The son lied. "But look, you're hurting her feelings. It turns out that she has no right to anything," Kevin said doubtfully. He was worried about Betty. Ever since she'd taken over as manager, even though Ethan was technically the manager, the firm's profits had increased manifold, and his son's wife was still broke. "We should at least give her an apartment." That's what Kevin was thinking that evening. He was also glad that Ethan was finally becoming more serious. There was even a tenderness and warmth in his voice. Kevin didn't know that his son was just mimicry and pretending to be what his father wanted him to be. If people knew how fleeting life is, they would never procrastinate on important decisions, and many problems would be avoided. But there always seems to be plenty of time ahead, even if your heart is racing. Kevin didn't have time to realize his plans and somehow provide for Betty. 3 months later, a heart attack took him from this life. He only had time to learn that he would have a granddaughter and asked her to be named Cindy. Because when Kevin once lost all hope of surviving one of his business trips, an old woman in an abandoned village gave him this paper icon. And then he was suddenly on the mend. "Of course, we'll call her Cindy," Kevin Betty promised. "You'll have a granddaughter named Cindy." "It is clear that the lady will be serious," the young woman joked. As for Ethan, he didn't care. Could Betty have known that as soon as her father-in-law was gone, Ethan's behavior would change radically? A week later, Christina moved in. "I'd like you to meet her. My almost ex-wife is my wife-to-be." He let out a dry chuckle. Ethan, the brunette with prominent breasts and an equally prominent heel almost like a Kardashian, nodded proudly. "But Ethan, what's wrong with you?" "We're expecting a baby girl," Betty said. There must be some mistake, she thought. Maybe he can't go after a sudden stroke, or maybe someone slandered her, and Ethan thinks the baby isn't his. But Ethan didn't think anything, as usual. He didn't change, he just stopped pretending. People who have something in their heads are very hard to believe. But there are some people who really don't have anything, at least not useful, in their heads. Betty didn't want to believe until the last minute that Ethan was really divorcing her. That's how abruptly she was looking for an excuse for his behavior. After all, the woman had worked so hard to love him and bring his firm as much value as possible. Relocating. Miranda and the guest house today. Or better yet, move anywhere you want out of sight. I'm gonna divorce you before the baby's born anyway. My lawyer will come up with something to prove adultery. Betty started babbling that she never cheated on him. Stupid. I know it's my baby. But now I'm left with a fortune after Daddy's gone. I'll just prove that you cheated on me. And then you can take me wherever you want and prove me wrong. Just be warned, lawyers are expensive. Leaked ship, Ethan said rudely. And by the way, I took your savings. I'll give it to you when you sign all the divorce papers. I'm sorry, love. I had to do it, because otherwise you would have dragged our divorce out too long. Ethan let out another hoarse laugh. Cindy rushed into the room and climbed into the closet. There really wasn't any money. She had some on her card, but it would only be enough to get by for a few months. She walked resolutely into her husband's room. Ethan, listen, we need to talk. Betty handed him the test results. You see, I have cancer, and I may not survive this birth. Who's our Cindy gonna be with? If you don't feel sorry for my Miranda, be a human being. I kept your firm afloat for 5 years. I've worked weekends, I've worked nights, I've done reports. Never took an extra penny for myself. At least give me my savings. It's despicable of you. Your child will be an orphan, if it survives. She believed Ethan couldn't be so bad. He just has to take pity on her. He'll offer her something. Some kind of a handout. Some kind of a way out. How are you gonna die? I got a defective wife, too. All the more reason to get out, you fool. Today I was going to offer you a lower-ranking position in my office while you hand things over to Christina. But there's no point in keeping you sick now. I mean, you're almost out of the woods. And I don't like drama. I don't care about you. Dying idiot. That makes more sense. Ethan yelled at her and added, "It was my father who loved you and turned a blind eye to my shenanigans. As long as I pretended to love you and took the path of correction. And I don't want you or a child with a beggar's eyebrow like that. And a sick beggar's eyebrow, too." Betty was trembling. She left her husband's office and started crying on the stairs. Her fingers had become important and could no longer hold the cool marble of the banister. Everything she had feared for so many years had come true. And even worse, for now she was dying. Her cancer is advancing rapidly, and not only does she have Miranda on her hands, but she's also pregnant with Cindy. It's true what people say. If things didn't work out with your first husband, it's better not to go on sometimes. What can I do? I mean, that bastard just stole most of her savings. What if he gets drunk tonight and tells the guards to throw them out? Mommy, I heard that, sweetheart. I've already put Jack in the cage and packed up valuables and documents and called a cab. We have to leave right now. Uncle Ethan was always cruel. You just never noticed it before. Her daughter Miranda was about to turn 11. She was a curly blonde, like her father, only much prettier. She looked all grown up now. She was supposed to be the one to support and comfort her. It was the other way around. But Ethan stole my savings, and I was stupid enough to keep it in a shoebox. It's true. You can take the girl out of the province, but you can't take the province out of the girl. Things just changed so dramatically, and I didn't see it coming. It's become Betty, Mom. Now we have to move to a hotel as soon as possible. I've already found out where I can stay cheap, and with Jack. I've packed my things. We should go. We'll talk about it later. Right now, we have to leave as soon as possible, her little girl repeated in a firm voice. Betty suddenly realized that she wasn't so unlucky in her love life. What a smart little girl she had, huh? Miranda was not confused, unlike her. As mother and daughter were on their way downstairs, a security guard stopped them. "Betty, I'm sorry, but there are orders. The owner told you to check your belongings so you don't take anything valuable." The guard averted his eyes in embarrassment. "Otherwise, I'll just get fired," he added and pointed to the cameras that were everywhere. "What is there to search?" The woman nodded silently and waited patiently while he examined the suitcases. There was no more cash. Poe so hesitantly held a pair of modest gold and silver jewelry in his hand. Betty had bought them herself with her own wages. After all, her husband had never given her anything. But there was no point in talking about it now. "We should ask the owner," muttered and blushed, nodding at the jewelry. Mom let her take it. "Let's go," Miranda said, and moved determinedly toward the exit. Christopher sighed and handed her the jewelry back to her. "I'm sorry, this is awkward. But I need this job. I'm sorry," he muttered and helped them carry their things out. "Give me that, dummy." Ethan, who had already had a lot on his chest, snatched the modest gold and silver jewelry out of the guard's hands and disappeared. "That's it, darling. You don't kick a man when he's down. You trample him. I'll give you this one last lesson." Christopher blushed even thicker, and as the owner ran off, he suddenly slipped Betty a note. It said, "Mistress, give me your card number. I'll help you in any way I can." Betty nodded gratefully. In the 5 years she had lived in this house, she had made friends with all the staff, and she was glad that at least one of them treated her with real sincerity. An economy cab took her to an equally frugal hotel. It gave her and her daughter time to think things over. "Miranda, I know you don't like my father's grandfather, but we have to go to him because we're running out of money. And I'm very sick. We won't be able to live in a hotel indefinitely," Betty said to my daughter after they arrived. "Mom, no one searched the place. It's great that he hisses at anyone who gets in his cage." Suddenly, Miranda laughed out loud. She hugged the huge fluffy cat and pulled his balls apart in his thick Siberian fur. Showed that instead of a collar around his neck, he had an expensive watch that 5 years ago her father-in-law wanted to give Betty. She turned it down then, but Miranda took it and kept it. "Miranda, you're so full of shit, but where are we going to sell them?" Betty asked. She didn't know anyone who would pay a few $1 million for a watch. A specialty store would take at least half the price and give it away. Maybe even more. "I found out everything on the internet. We'll go there tomorrow," the girl said cheerfully. Of course, she was scared too, but she had to support her mother. Miranda believed that if her mother could survive the first few days after all these terrible events, she would definitely make it through. As for her illness, who knows? Maybe when she got rid of that ghoul, Uncle Ethan, the disease would recede. I mean, her stepdad was eating pounds of her mom's nerves. Anybody could have gotten worse. "Miranda, come on." That was a neat trick. Betty kissed his daughter. "There's more to Mom than that." "Uncle Ethan only took one shoebox," Miranda said. "And the other one? We were searched." Betty wondered. Her daughter surprised her more and more. That's how resourceful she is. She never gets lost. The woman even felt better. Her daughter wouldn't be lost with a character like that. But what will happen to Cindy if she ever makes it? "Mommy, I asked Uncle Ethan to borrow my favorite encyclopedia." How pathetically pathetic. After all, I'm such a smart girl, and I love to read so much. Miranda stuck out her tongue and mimed the naive volume. She was talking to her stepfather who never adopted her. "And what are we going to sell her to?" Betty asked and thought to herself, "I don't think the encyclopedia is worth much." "No, Mom, look how enriching knowledge is," Miranda shouted enthusiastically. She flipped through the pages to about the middle. And there it was discovered that the second part of the encyclopedia was taped up with Scotch tape, and there the money was kept. Of course, it was only half of the savings, but still enough for a year of frugal living. My daughter would jump up and down and scream, "Mommy, it's our money you earned, so there's no harm in taking it from Ethan." Loudly pouring laughter shouted out in daughter. "Miranda, of course I'm sorry I was so stupid and didn't realize. But how did you realize he could take my savings?" Betty wondered. That's how you raise a daughter. And suddenly you find out that you have a personal genius who hides under the guise of a little curly-haired girl. Just overheard. I mean, Ethan's dumb as a tree, and he's all over his Christina. But don't worry, Mommy, they're bound to go broke. Uncle Kevin also said that if you are not there and he is not there, everything will fall apart, said Miranda. And then she cried suddenly. Betty had not expected such a transition. She hugged her daughter and held her tightly against her. Her forehead was burning. Of course it was. Miranda was just a little child, and she had shown such great courage and ingenuity in trying to protect her. She needs to rest. Betty is now determined to survive at all costs. She had to make it to Miranda's majority. Miranda, don't cry. We'll figure something out. Mom's not that stupid. It happens, mumbled Betty and frantically stroked her daughter's soft-framed hair. Mom, and you're not going to kill Cindy in your tummy, are you? I really want a baby sister. Already falling asleep in her mother's arms, muttered Miranda. You don't? No, of course not. Why did you decide that? Asked the mother to her daughter. That's what the stupid picture said. Like there's nothing to worry about. You'll just get rid of Cindy because you don't need the trouble, said the girl. Not getting rid of anything. Ethan judges people by themselves, but luckily, almost all people are better than Ethan. So he's not a good judge of people. How could I betray Cindy? Especially since you and Jack saved us all. You'll see, we'll tell Cindy this story, and she'll laugh with delight and thank her big sister. And about Mom, we will say that Mom at that moment sang to her father and looked for goodness and justice in her father, Betty said. And he turned out to be Kashi and sneezed over the gold. Through sleep, Miranda added, and fell asleep. Betty gently carried her daughter to the bed, and there also moved smoothly on soft pillows Jack. The cat was already 11 years old, but Siberian nightmares live a long time, so the nightmare carried his advanced age with dignity and jumped on the bed silently. He nestled comfortably under Miranda's side and fell asleep. Mother once again felt his forehead temperature as if there was no fever. Apparently, the child was just overexcited. What's she like? She lived deaf and blind and didn't prepare for anything. And he thought he was a sneaky fixture who grabbed the winning lottery ticket, when in fact she worked her ass off for Ethan and ended up broke. Or rather, she might have stayed if it hadn't been for Miranda. Well, Betty, out of habit, said a prayer and thanked God for what she had and what she didn't have. She did that every night. Lord, thank you for wonderful children and for the fact that I'm still alive and that I have something to live for, and thankful that I don't have that cruel asshole Ethan around me anymore. Of course, God. Enemies should be loved too. Betty pictured Ethan as a moral coworker. In her imagination, he had a transparent head for some reason, without any extra weight or brain, and he threw himself like plasticine, and all around him were some wildly colored aunts like Christina and the like, as soulless to everyone but themselves. Then the woman was relieved and could almost feel sorry for her husband. So she added, Lord, save and preserve this immoral cripple. If it is your will, I release him from all his debts, and I hope very much that you will also release me from my debts and allow me to raise my children. After the prayer, she sat in silence for a while and decided that this week she would have to go to communion. She needed to restore peace to her soul, because today she had experienced a wild attack of hatred, but she couldn't let hatred and revenge take root in her soul. There was a little Cindy growing in her belly right now, and Miranda needed a loving mother, not a bitch. She'd have to pull herself together and stay sane. And they'd got more than enough money for now. They don't have to go back to her father and the drunk, but here to return just to her provincial town. Not to be regarded as in the capital money is not a bad idea at all. It's no use going to Kevin. Here also from her recently tried to borrow money once again, forgot that he threw them and laughed at them. All that's left is a fresh start. She has enough money in the town to buy an old but decent apartment there. But every day has its own worries. Tomorrow she would get up and figure out what to do. In the morning, Betty was awakened by a phone call. Betty, is it true that you've left Ethan? The woman looked at the watch she had taken off Jack's furry neck yesterday and saw that it wasn't even 7 o'clock yet. She tried to wake up and realized it was Mason, the son of her late father-in-law's mate, calling. Mason, it's a good morning, but not really. To be honest, Ethan's the one who kicked me out and fired me. He's got a new wife in mind. Betty answered in her sleep. He did. Where do you live now? Mason asked. We're staying in a cheap apartment hotel for now. By the way, since you called, maybe there's some work for me. I'm pregnant, and I'm not feeling well. Betty decided not to say that she was also seriously ill, and now she was getting tired by 12 o'clock in the afternoon. But she couldn't have chemotherapy. She was pregnant. What's the job? You're pregnant, you're stressed, you're animals, aren't you? Give me the address. I'll send a driver for you. Live in my city apartment. I got divorced 6 months ago. My wife found someone younger and prettier. Mason was trying to sound casual, but you could hear that he was taking the separation very hard. Betty knew that he adored his wife, though she considered him a sort of personal page, and yet she never worked a day. And she was a hick like Betty. Somebody's lucky. Mason, no, don't. We'll get by. You see, I'm sick, to be honest. I'm gonna move back to my hometown. As long as there's a little money to be made, I'll live as modestly as possible. Betty said honestly. She didn't want to put herself around his neck. The woman had already learned Ethan's lesson that you can't beat a man lying down, but you can trample him. And I didn't trust anyone else. Not even Mason, with whom I've developed a good relationship. Ah, but you don't throw yourself out of the fire. Into the fire. Let's do it tonight. I'll be there, and you can tell me all about it. Is there a coffee shop about the party? Asked the man. I think so, she mumbled. But that's where we'll meet tonight at 18 o'clock. Is that convenient for you? Asked Mason. Yes, of course. After all, it's summer and luckily Miranda doesn't have to go to school. And I'm unemployed, sick, pregnant. There's plenty of time. Betty grinned bitterly. Well, that's great. See you then, Mason summarized. There were reasons why the man had called so early. Late the night before he had gotten a call from a drunk Ethan trying to sell his father's firm. That's how the whole Betty thing came to light. True, Ethan said his bitch of a wife had left him. So Mason decided to find out what was what before he gave Ethan a final answer. Besides, he respected Betty, and he even liked the woman. Knowing Ethan's sneaky temper, he was sure something was up. The way he talked about the wife who'd left him. Over-dramatized. The falseness was obvious. Is there something the school's not telling us? Mason thought. And he was right. That night, Betty told Mason the whole story. Mentioned that her illness had always been a time bomb. So she wasn't being completely honest with Ethan. Betty, but even if you weren't completely honest with him, he was dishonest with you from start to finish. You knew he popped up within a month of Kevin being gone. Took all the money out of his accounts and banked all the helicopters. And now he's trying to sell me the firm at full price. Asked Mason. No, I didn't. I only handled the major clients. Ethics told me to stay out of everything else. The day after my father-in-law passed away. You're lucky you're not entitled to anything in the prenup. I mean, you don't get any debts either. I'm sorry. It's just that Kevin kept me in the loop and asked me to make sure his son didn't leave you penniless, Mason said. But now you definitely need to file for divorce as soon as possible. But what about our baby? I'm pregnant with Ethan's baby, Betty said. Does your husband want the baby? Mason asked bluntly. He knew the answer. Because drunk Ethan had told him a lot of things last night, hadn't he? Like he'd seen babies in his grave. Let that fool get rid of the baby, even though it's old enough. Not according to him. Bitterly, Betty said. The rose-colored glasses began to fall from her eyes, and she realized that if some people seem mean, they don't seem mean, they are mean. Then tell Ethan that you've gotten rid of the baby girl and that there's no impediment to signing the papers, or tell him the baby isn't his. He doesn't know how much trouble he's in yet. Tell me, what idiot has been handling his cases for the last month? I mean, you'd have to ruin a firm like that in a heartbeat, Mason said. Wasn't Christina in charge? Betty sighed. She'd heard from their departing clients that no one wanted to work with them lately. But to the last minute, she wanted to believe in the good. Let me tell you, the disaster is just beginning. So sign the papers as soon as you can. Tell them you're going back to the country and be done with it. That's what Mason said. She did just that. She signed the papers and prepared a fake certificate for Ethan that Cindy was no more, just as she'd expected. Ethan never returned any of the money she'd been promised, and when he gave one last sinister chuckle and slapped Christina victoriously on the heel, Betty wasn't surprised at all. Goodbye, fool. Go to your Crimea and die there, Ethan told her. Goodbye, big problems and huge debts. Betty answered him mentally, but aloud she only said goodbye dryly. A few more months passed. Cindy was born a little premature, but she was healthy. The doctor's predictions did not come true. Betty's disease had not worsened, and now she could finally undergo chemotherapy. True, she couldn't breastfeed Cindy because of it, but the choice was between life and nursing. After all, she was lucky enough to be able to give birth to a second daughter. All the while, they lived in a service apartment at Mason's. And though for now Betty couldn't do anything in particular to help the man with his work, She consoled herself with the thought that as soon as he recovered a little, she would be sure to work it off. After all, he had paid for her treatment and helped to get Miranda into a school no less good than the one the girl had attended before. Lessons she'd learned. And the money was safely stored in her account. Plus, she'd written a will in her daughter's favor. But she didn't know who to appoint as guardian yet. She didn't want to think about being gone. She wanted to live more than ever. Still, it's a pity I didn't meet someone from the beginning of my life. A normal, good man. Like Mason or someone like him. I wasted my whole life on Michael. Don't be sad. And the medics. But the normal woman's destiny had passed me by, Betty reflected. Christina never married her husband. After all, it turned out that her father had told her that he was already billions of dollars in debt, so that the woman managed to carry her slender, long legs in time to the world of other men, like all the other additional wives of Ethan. Apparently, he didn't call me a basic wife for nothing. Betty thought with a bitter smile. After all, once the base wife was kicked out, everything fell apart. The woman looked at herself in the mirror. A short hedgehog now adorned her head. Instead of her once luxurious mane of hair, her face stuck out, but overall she looked pretty good. The doctors gave a good prognosis. Another year passed. Ethan moved out of his mansion. The IRS blocked his accounts, and his assets were seized. Of course, he managed to stash some things away. But now he had to live. It's scary to think in an apartment like a mere mortal, and he had to rent an apartment. And though while he lived quite comfortably, by the standards of an ordinary mortal, but it seemed to the man compared to the former glamour, that he was almost a bum. We should return the jar. Maybe it's not dead yet. One day a saving thought, as it seemed to him, knocked on the man's head. The man remembered with nostalgia how dashingly the former destroyed all the problems, and even the most conflicted clients eventually concluded deals for 5 years. And he had ruined it all himself. Ethan, not thinking long, went to the provincial town. After all, where else would his ex be? Probably struggling to get by. After all, neither she's back. Her first husband has no place to live himself. Ethan checked Michael finally lost at roulette, and now he's homeless or living with friends. If you're lucky, so there is definitely no need to look for a jar. The next day, Ethan approached the gray and gray Khrushchevka. As luck would have it, the neighbor's grandmother was barely crawling in front of him, so it was not even necessary to call the intercom. Fate itself tells me that I'm doing everything, Ethan thought correctly. He hair-hopped to the 4th floor and rang the doorbell. No one answered. Ethan knocked, and a disgruntled grunt sounded at the door. "What are you selling that I don't have any money?" He was answered by an unshaven, well-drunk man in a dirty, stretched-out t-shirt and sweatpants. "No, I'm still the husband. I'm her ex," Ethan said. He was expecting it to come from somewhere in the back of the room. "You smell like a bird." Betty in a robe, and tell him how long she's been waiting for him, or something like that. But so far he hadn't seen anyone but that drunkard in front of him. "What ex?" "You're Michael, aren't you? You're the one who called me. You're the one who asked to stay at my place for free. You didn't have a place," asked the Angina dad. And he added, "I don't need no freeloaders. Betty told me that you kicked them out with Miranda and signed a paternity waiver not to give a penny for the child. Get out." "Yeah, they're not." "Ethan," I specified Ethan. The man really hoped his ex didn't say anything bad about him. And Ethan, "You're not an R word, are you?" Father made a cruel joke. "Because I do." "The pants are too white and tight." "I don't think so. He's got an ugly slant." Alkesh, critical, measured him with a glance from head to toe. "He's all right. I've decided to return the can," Ethan said. He decided to put up with the vulgar hick and his stupid jokes. After all, he had an important goal to deal with the bullshit that came over him in the form of multi-billion-dollar debts and a dreary existence on pennies. Dyken had a baby with Mason or something. She never came to see me. Just called to say she's doing well. Cindy had my granddaughter. I asked for her address, but she said there was no shame in coming to see her. You see me, but a little money at least sends the old man for bread. The alky took out an old pair of underpants from his sweatpants pocket and blew his nose. You can see what kind of bread this man spends his money on, Ethan thought. The whole corridor was littered with glassware from the Green Snake, and a lot of cents. The angry one was angry. The man began to feel sorry for himself. And why did he go to this circle to find out that his ex was really tortured with Mason and the child was not born of him? I bet she lied about being sick. What a bitch. What's it to you? The alky argued. Want a loan? If you want it, I won't give it to you. I can see right away that you're running away from debt and not from a good life. You're looking for my daughter. That's why all her exes started looking for her when you started yelling. Father laughed wickedly. Ethan ran swiftly down the stairs, and in the wake of him ran to tell street pants are not for manner. Ethan, and that your spirit be gone. I've known them. They stink quietly. You can hear them far away. Then there was a swearing match. Some nasty old ladies were already peeking out of the apartment doors on the first and second floors. They were interested to see how her exes were chasing after her one by one. But they couldn't catch up with her. They say she now lives in the capital as an important lady. That's good. That's right. She can't live with her father. Her mother and her boozing and partying would have sent her to the grave before her time. And the banks would be on her nerves. She's a good girl. Let at least one woman in the family be happy. That's what the old ladies discussed among themselves. And though everyone considered them evil gossips, they were happy for Betty and her two daughters. After all, a normal woman to a normal woman always wishes for happiness, even if one is already in her 80s and the other is only 30. Who was that crooked eye visiting you? Asked one of the neighbors. Ethan had not had time to run out of the entrance. Another agent, Betty's father, replied. But he's not as scary as Michael. That one is shabby. That to the dumpster, said the neighbor. Why did he come over? I thought he just called. You threw him down the stairs, didn't you? You were covered by a squirrel just then. The old lady laughed. Wow. And I was on crutches. The drunkard was surprised. Not bad. I barely got away. I also threw kitchen knives at him. You were going to throw and ran after him with a target to stick on his back. The satisfied neighbor giggled and added, don't be afraid. You landed in a puddle. I forgot to take this for liquid. I gotta stop. I only really remembered the Mason that Betty came to see me with. He was cute. He looked like a normal person. At least my daughter's lucky. Yeah, I've seen him. He was so nice to say hello to us, and he even gave us little gifts. Honey, tea, and some other little things. My wife and daughter were chased away by Betty's father. I used to hide them in my room a lot. And the other neighbors too. The old woman looked at me reproachfully, not at her father. I know. Drunks and cum, the man sighed. That's why Betty didn't have a collection of freaks. At least the third one was normal. Would you be cured, Betty's father? I heard that Mason offered to pay for your treatment, and he said he wasn't cured yet. You can't visit them. He's right. Mason, that's what the neighbor said. He's right. Still, it's a shame. Betty's father allows Betty's own father to put conditions on Betty's father, but he remembered how many nerves he had exhausted his family and only waved at himself. It was not for him to judge and take offense, and yet he did not regret that he had thrown out that leering man today, and that, as it turned out, he had let the Baron's first husband down the stairs. Trash, not people. But he liked Mason. He did not leave his daughter in illness. He could trust her now, if anything, and he could die in peace, though he as a father had done nothing good for England. But still Betty's father was glad that she had found her happiness. And the granddaughters, what sweet little angels. He didn't deserve that. And yet he lived to see his granddaughters. But his wife is no longer alive. And it's his fault. Yeah, he had a little more to drink this morning. He's got to go to treatment. When he got home, He took out the doctor's card that Mason had left and resolutely dialed a simple number. "Mason, my dad called me. He's at the clinic, getting treatment. He said you paid for it. Why'd you lie to him about being my husband?" she asked Mason. The woman was on the mend, and although the doctors did not guarantee that the disease would not return, but there was a positive trend. "Well, you'll love me sooner or later anyway. After all, we've already been to Gory. All that's left is joy," said Mason. "Mason, why do you need me? You're rich and you're still young for a man. I mean, 35 isn't old at all. You're a groom. You'll find a woman who'll give you a baby," sighed Betty deep. "I've fallen in love with you, and I'll wait for you. You think that some man will just for nothing for so many years ostensibly to advise on the work of a lady if he does not have a view on her." The conspirators winked at Mason. "And as for kids, I already have a son from my first marriage, and we have a great relationship, and your Dennis gets along with the girls. He's a worldly guy, a good boy, just like you." Betty agreed. "But still, I'm not fit to be your wife, because the disease can come back." "Then you know what, marry me on terms of convenience," Mason suggested. "I'll adopt your girls and buy you an apartment. Or do you want me to buy your ex-Ethan's firm? He's trying to sell it to someone on the condition that they just pay the taxes." "Mason, but I don't really see myself as a businesswoman. Can I just work for you as a hired manager when I get better? I mean, I have to work off your expenses for us. And now you're spending money on my dad." Betty's got a song. "Listen, why don't you become a masochist?" "What fantasies?" said Mason. "Marry me, that's all." "Did I punch your Ethan in the face for nothing?" Betty laughed. Ethan really did stand guard outside Mason's office and attack the man, yelling, "I know who Betty gave birth to Cindy. So you betrayed me and my father, and we picked you up out of the mud." So Mason had to show Ethan that nice muscles in the gym impress the ladies but don't help in a fight. "Mason, I've always wanted a husband like you, but I'm afraid of everything. I've already decided to invest my small savings in an apartment. I'll work for you if you'll let me, and I'll pay the mortgage. I don't want to depend on conniving men anymore," said Betty. "All right, then, better not a mortgage, but an interest-free loan from my firm." "That won't stop you from accepting advances from me?" asked Mason. "It won't," smiled Betty. "I'm going to buy the firm from Ethan. That'll be a job for you. Help you rebuild from the ashes. But I'm not going to let you work like Papa Carlo. Am I going to give you a whole department to run?" Mason asked and stroked her cheek affectionately. "I agree," Betty said. After another year, things got better at Ethan's former firm, and the children spent almost all their time with Betty at work because she didn't want to give Cindy to babysitters and had set up a children's corner in her office. Miranda missed her little sister and would run straight here from school. Dennis had grown accustomed to his little sister as his own. Mason's love for them was passed on to her son. In addition, Mason's ex-wife now once again threw herself into the arms of passion and found a young admirer. Mom had paid little attention to Dennis before, and now he was annoying her. Luckily, Dennis and Miranda were the same age, and they always had something to talk about. Cindy was like a doll, because she was just a baby. The crazy family didn't stop there. They installed a cat corner in the study. For His Majesty Jack, Mason bought back the very lucky watch that had once made Betty and Miranda optimistic, and it was back on the cat's neck. And it was the safest place, because the cat wouldn't let anyone touch them except the owners, the customers. All this pleasant nonsense was not embarrassing. On the contrary, they would come back and be glad they no longer had to deal with Ethan. One evening, Miranda called Betty over to the television. Mommy, look, Ethan is playing himself," shouted the girl enthusiastically. Betty walked over to the screen and was surprised to see that Ethan was actually starring in some second-rate ghoul show. As it turned out, after the sale of the company, he went around to all the exes, like in the fairy tale cat house, and tried to sit on each of their necks. But none of the additional wives did not accept him. Not Sweetie, not Christina, not the red-headed twins, not the brave biker Nancy, or anyone else. But his drunken scuffle with biker Nancy was accidentally filmed on his cell phone. After another scandal and begging women and money, Ethan threw Ethan off his bike and yelled, "I don't care if you're a zero right now. You are zero." And Ethan retaliated by trying to claw her riveted boots and yelling, "Bitch, when I was in the money, didn't you say you loved me? Well, I do. But the money from you, ghouls, squinting my eyes pulls me, only to vomit," asked Nancy and kicked him in the face with a boot. The clip of Ghoul and the biker got a lot of hits. Nancy and Ethan were invited to star in the TV series Biker. She declined. They didn't pay her enough. And she didn't like small money. But Ethan, the amount seemed quite decent because he was forced to move to an ordinary studio in the suburbs and even had to learn about the existence of stocks in stores. So the skill to constantly portray someone and finally was monetized. And Ethan found his calling. Another year later, Betty decided to marry Mason, and he presented her with the very house she and Ethan had once lived in. After all, his wife had told him a lot about how nice the neighbors and wonderful staff were. "Landlady, why didn't you take help from us then? We collected money for the first time." The first thing the security guard asked was Christopher. "But our Jack turned out to be rich and supported us for the first time." "Yes, Miranda." Betty winked at his daughter, and she laughed merrily. Little Cindy laughed after them. In Mason's arms, the girl didn't understand why everyone was laughing, but she found the very idea of the rich one amusing. Mason's son Dennis laughed too. After all, Miranda told him this story 1,000 times, and it was even funnier than watching TV series with Ethan as the main ghoul. Christopher didn't understand anything, but he was glad that justice and joyful laughter would finally reign in this house. "Mistress, a man has arrived. He called himself Robert and said he could visit you. He's cured of alcoholism. I'm keeping him in the guest house for now. He arrived yesterday. He really doesn't have a drop in his mouth. Should I invite him over or what?" Invite him in, Mason said. "He's my father-in-law. Only you keep an eye on him, because he needs an eye on him. But I've got a diamond in the rough. He's got a wife to look out for." Mason hugged Betty and joyfully stepped into a happy family future.